We have access on a daily basis to senior leaders and to, I guess, influential decision makers who can make changes in the hiring structure and what they're doing.
Over the last couple of years, we've made sure that as a business, our culture and the service that we offer is a representation of what we want to see in society. So we will be talking to these senior leaders about some of the challenges and getting into detail around some of the initiatives that have been successful and worked for them.
What we really would like to do is kind of normalise the conversation and get people comfortable with having conversations around diversity and inclusion.
Hi and welcome to the DEI Bucket List. And today we've got Elizabeth Kerry from PA Consulting. Hi Elizabeth.
Hi Terry, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. As the Head of Inclusion Engagement at PA Consulting, thanks so much for joining us on the show and for sharing your learnings with us. As you know, we're going to talk through DEI and the talent life cycle. So let's start with a quick introduction. Can you give us a snapshot of your career history to date?
Of course I can. So I began my career in DE&I at a global law firm where I was their UK lead and responsible for initiatives like the UK legal sector's first gender transitioning policy and a generational diversity network. I then moved to a smaller financial services organization where I added employee engagement to my portfolio before moving back to a large global technology company and then finally landing as PA's head of inclusion and engagement. And I like to say that given my varied sector background, PA sits really nicely at the intersection of my career history and experience.
Thank you so much. It's so great to have you on the show with us. To kick us off, what are your initial thoughts around managing DEI in the workplace?
Yeah, so I absolutely love what I do, but just as it is with any career, it's not without some of its challenges. So I think it's really important that while you're focusing on driving systemic and cultural change, which can take time, make sure that you celebrate some of the smaller successes along the way in order to keep yourself motivated as a start, but also to keep others motivated and engaged in the journey. And I think as well, in the past year, the world has obviously changed considerably, both with the pandemic, as well as with social unrest due to things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of anti-Asian community hate crimes. And organizations, I think, are really starting to tune into how what's happening in the world can impact all of us, both professionally and personally. So it's important for companies to be on the front foot and be able to quickly adapt. But it's also really vital that you provide ongoing support to your people.
Thank you. And there's so many initial thoughts there, I think that everybody would resonate with for sure. Firstly, I think to kick us off, so when we think about hiring new talent as the employer, the thinking around inclusion should be present, obviously, in every part of the process. Do you have any tips when it comes to talent pooling and building diverse networks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you that it definitely needs to be part of every part of the process. And both employers and search firms need to consider how they're casting the widest possible net when searching for candidates. At a graduate level, there are a range of diversity related organizations that you can work with in sourcing diverse candidates. So for example, at PA, we've recently partnered with an organization called Generation Success, and their mission is to advance social mobility by empowering young people of diversity to reach their career aspirations. And we're working with them in a range of ways, but including in recruiting diverse talent. And there's lots of other great organizations out there, just like Generation Success. Some are industry specific, others are diversity strand specific, and they'll work with you in widening access to your organization. At more senior levels, it can be a bit more challenging because in many cases, the talent pool has already been reduced. But that's definitely not to make an excuse because absolutely diverse talent always exists. It's rather to stress how important it is to ensure you're being even more vigilant when recruiting. And I think if you're working with executive search firms, it's really important that you understand how they are proactively ensuring they build their networks of diverse candidates. So for example, at PA, we've just asked the search firms and agencies we work with to complete an inclusion and diversity supplier questionnaire so we can understand how they source candidates. And I know many search firms, just like Annapurna, do really great work in these areas, and have built fantastic relationships with candidates and are often members of professional networking organizations for different groups. So for example, a women's network, and they're able to really establish great relationships with diverse candidates through those methods.
Perfect, thank you. It's actually thanks so much for saying us. I think obviously we have really been trying to diversify the networking pools that we're a part of, but obviously those are quite small steps that I think everybody could actually action quite quickly. Obviously there's so many different networks available to people now. I think obviously more than ever with various tools, obviously LinkedIn being a good example. So many people can just, I think, hopefully become part of wider groups that also probably link back into their own businesses, and it's probably helpful for them as well, for sure. I think then the next thing is obviously a lot of organisations rely on both search firms as well as referrals. Is there anything that they need to be mindful of when considering referrals for roles?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I understand there are lots of great benefits to referrals. You can leverage existing relationships. You might have a better idea because you know someone really well about, if they're the right person for a role. But I think it's also important that we're mindful of how unconscious biases affect our personal networks. So you may have heard of affinity bias, which is our inclination to focus on and lead towards people who have similar interests, skills, and backgrounds to ourselves. And essentially, in the context of referrals, it means your personal network is more likely to be very similar to you. So it's particularly important that you consider how you expand and think outside of your traditional network. So you're not just bringing more people like you into the organization.
It's so true, isn't it? And I think obviously it's when people are creatures of habit, I think is probably a good way of explaining that. So yes, I think obviously, yeah, definitely a need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I said, it's often down to our unconscious biases. We all do it without even knowing that we're doing it. But if you think around about, who your close friends are, they're probably people who are similar to you in various different ways. So that's where it becomes important to really start thinking outside of that immediate network.
Perfect, thank you. And then this obviously leads on to things like role advertisement and the job description itself. Are there any insights you can share regarding how to effectively write role profiles to activate a diverse talent pool?
Yeah, of course. And I think if you get job descriptions right, then you're making the path for the rest of the recruitment process a lot easier for yourself. And there's a few things to be mindful of here. So I think the first is to be conscious of the difference in what's essential versus what's desired for a role. So we all learn so much on the job, particularly around things that are culture dependent. So make sure that when you're drafting that job spec, you only list the absolute must-haves as essential. I think this is particularly important when it comes to thinking about requirements like minimum qualifications and career experience, which tend to narrow the talent pool. So for example, does someone really need to have 10 years of experience doing the role? It's important that we hire for potential. And that's not to say that you can't also list some of the more desired criteria, which can be helpful when shortlisting candidates. Just ensure you're really clear on what's essential versus, what's desired. The next thing I'd say is to be specific and clear on expectations. So don't talk in jargon or general terms, which some candidates might not understand, particularly if you're recruiting candidates who may not necessarily have worked in the industry or in that type of role before. But equally, it's important to be honest about expectations. So we don't ever want to lose people just after they've been recruited. But I think, this can be particularly damaging at senior and more high profile levels. And finally, I'd say, ensure that you're focusing on the right person for the team, not just for the role. So you want to be clear that you're building teams and leadership with different perspectives, backgrounds, and skills.
Perfect, thanks so much. I think that leads then into whether there's a particular method you can suggest when considering how to fairly review CVs and create shortlists.
Yeah, so this goes back to why I said it's so important that you nail that job description, and take time when crafting that role profile, and particularly ensuring that you don't include any unnecessary requirements. So I think a well-written role profile can really stand as your rubric or your framework for shortlisting candidates, both at the CV review and interview stages. So use the role profile and the competencies, capabilities, and skills listed in that description to create a scoring and evaluation system before reviewing candidate CVs, and then ensure that you apply it to all candidates. At this stage, I also think it's really important to start ensuring you use more than one person to shortlist applicants. And this is, again, going back to what we said about unconscious bias. It's to reduce the impact of any one person's unconscious bias. But equally, you also need to ensure that anyone who's involved is fully briefed on what information is relevant and what should not be considered as part of the decision-making process.
Perfect, thank you. I think this is quite topical, obviously, particularly when it comes to recruiting and obviously CVs and knowing what to do, and I guess how to be as fair as possible. Sometimes we perhaps don't think as much as we should around those areas, and I know that everybody is trying to be more mindful, and I think that certainly, hopefully, those little tips will obviously make a big impact. So thank you.
I think that's absolutely right. I think a lot of the things I've mentioned today probably seem like they take a lot of time, but really it's just a couple of minutes here and there, and adding that just pays off in huge ways in terms of ensuring that you attract a diverse range of candidates. So I know time is often very limited for many of us, but if you can just take a couple of minutes extra at each stage of the interview process, it will really pay off.
Perfect. So that leads us obviously into our next question, which is around making sure that we are providing fair interview processes, which obviously, again, is just so important. What advice can you share for effectively managing the process?
Yeah, so I think a top tip is to make sure you have clear interview roles and questions. So for senior roles in particular, we know that candidates often attend many interviews as part of the process. So ensure that everyone has a clear role and knows the questions they'll be asking each candidate, so that they're not getting the same questions every single time. I also think it's really great to try and have a diverse range of interviewers, though you don't want to do this at the expense of placing, a burden on a particular diverse group. So having the same women always interview, for example, or having it feel like it's a bit of a token gesture. But I think if it isn't possible to always have a diverse range of interviewers, be open and honest about that. So acknowledge that you would have liked to have more diversity in the interview process, but that it wasn't possible, and it's something that the organization is focusing on. So candidates understand how you're working to address this challenge, and understand that DE&I is a focus area for you. And I think going back also to that role profile we discussed during shortlisting, it's also important to use questions which will test the criteria in your job description. And then finally, a tip that I think often gets overlooked is how you market yourself as an inclusive employer. So it's really important that organizations do this generally. Things like, having an I&D page on your website, talking about some of your activities on social media. But then it's also critical to do this as part of the interview, because being an inclusive employer absolutely matters to candidates. We see people making decisions based on an organization's culture all the time. So take, again, just those couple of minutes, familiarize yourself with some of your recent DE&I initiatives, policies, maybe some of the employee networks and what they've been up to, and bring them up proactively and mention them to candidates during the interview.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Again, just so much insight there, that obviously small steps, but will have big impact, I think, if people hopefully even just apply some of those things into their methods, for sure. The final step in the hiring process is the candidate selection, and providing feedback to those who haven't been selected is also essential. What are your thoughts regarding this, and how best to go about this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think before you get to this stage, I'd recommend holding structured feedback sessions with all interviewers to review each candidate. Again, take your time during this session, think about each person as an individual, and make decisions based on ability and potential. And then after you've made the decision, give feedback to everyone. So take the time to give feedback, not only to the selected candidate and let them know that they've been successful, but also to the candidates who haven't been successful. I think sometimes we find those conversations to be difficult, and statistics have shown that we find this particularly difficult when giving feedback to different minority groups. But it's really important to demonstrate that you care about inclusion and diversity, and give some of that feedback to everyone equally. And then my final tip would be, don't forget about onboarding and integration. So after, a candidate has accepted the offer, they may have a notice period. Make sure that you reach out to them during that notice period, keep them engaged with what the organization is doing, and then also have a really great onboarding and integration plan for them when they join.
Perfect, thank you. I think obviously that the integration piece, particularly now in this day and age where everything is virtual, and we are kind of navigating through onboarding and working that out. Obviously, the making people feel included, I think, is so important. So it's very topical.
I agree. I joined PA during the pandemic, so I have only ever worked virtually, and I had a really great onboarding experience. They put a lot of thought and attention into how they onboard candidates virtually, though I have to say I am looking forward to meeting some of my colleagues in person, hopefully in the next couple of months.
Yes, I can imagine. I can't imagine that, actually. It's so strange, obviously, but then you kind of feel like you have met them because you see them every day virtually. So I think it just kind of feels natural.
Yeah, exactly. I half wonder if I'll recognize them in person, if it's going to be a lot different to how they look on Teams or a Zoom call, but I'm looking forward to it.
Hopefully soon. And thank you so much for talking us through your DEI bucket list tips for the talent life cycle. Really, really appreciate it. And I think so many things there that people will find useful. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, naturally, because the subject today is recruitment, a lot of what we focused on is around the importance of diversity and increasing access of opportunity for diverse candidates. But I think it's equally, if not more important, that organizations focus on inclusion. So I tend to say that if you get inclusion right, diversity will follow. Or in other words, if you create a really great culture, people will want to join and stay with your company. So while you're reviewing and minimizing bias in your recruitment process, make sure you're also focusing on creating an internal culture of inclusion, so that when people join your company, they feel they belong and that they can truly be themselves, so they want to stay with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's so true. And then just on a personal level, obviously we're talking about bucket lists. Is there anything on your bucket list that you'd like to share?
Yes. So I majored in writing at university, and I have always wanted to write a novel. Of course, I've had a year of being at home most of the time where I could have done this and have failed to do it. But maybe one day I will get to it and tick that off my bucket list.
Amazing. Any particular genre?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of classic murder mystery shows and books. So I'd love to write an Agatha Christie style whodunit.
Amazing. Well, let me have a read when you do get around to that. But thanks again, Elizabeth. So great to have you on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Terri.